A tragic tale of betrayal, premeditation, and deception. What seemed like a simple home invasion quickly turned into one of the most shocking crimes. This is the story of Niasia Perkins and her co-worker Calvin Collie, who set up her boyfriend and father of her children, Quinton Gray, in a fake break-in to cover up his brutal murder. In this story, we'll focus on the tragic events surrounding Quinton Gray, a rising rapper known as Hoodrich Montana, and the involvement of those closest to him. Niasia Perkins, Quinton's girlfriend and mother of his children, became the prime suspect after a call she made to 911 on the night of his death. Calvin Collie, Niasia's co-worker, also played a key role in the crime, helping to set up the situation that led to Quinton's murder. Quinton Gray, a man with big dreams and even bigger responsibilities, was killed in a calculated act of betrayal. In this video, we will examine the details of the murder, the investigation that followed, and how a fake break-in was used to cover up a brutal crime. Quinton Gray, known by his rap name Hoodrich Montana, was a man who had big dreams. At 30 years old, he was determined to make a name for himself in the music industry, a world that isn't easy to break into. Born and raised in a small town, Quinton had always loved music. He found comfort in rhythm and used his life's struggles to fuel his lyrics. His music was his escape, his passion, and the way he hoped to build a better future for his family. But Quinton wasn't just about the music. He was a devoted father, and nothing mattered more to him than his two sons, Gianni and Amiri. They were his world, and despite the difficulties that came with chasing a career in music, he made sure to stay involved in their lives. Even when times were tough, when money was tight, Quinton made sure his boys never went without. He spent long hours working on his music, and in his downtime, he was there for them. Playing with them, taking them out, and showing them how much he cared. The pressures of balancing fatherhood with a career in music were never easy, but Quinton didn't let that stop him. His goal wasn't just to make music, he wanted to create a life for his children, a life that would be different from his own growing up. He worked hard to give them the opportunities he never had, dreaming of a time when his success would allow him to provide them with the best life possible. Quinton believed in his talent and his future. His persona as Hoodrich Montana wasn't just a stage name, it was a reflection of his ambition and his belief that, no matter where he came from, he was destined for something bigger. Niasia Perkins was the woman in Quinton Gray's life, the girlfriend he chose to share his dreams and his challenges with. They had 2 children together, and from the outside, their relationship seemed like any other. Pictures of happy moments, birthday celebrations, and family outings filled their social media pages. Niasia often shared loving posts about her family, calling Quinton her everything and showing off their life together. But, as often happens behind closed doors, things weren't as perfect as they appeared. Though Quinton loved his family and was fully committed to his role as a father, his relationship with Niasia started to show signs of strain. There were whispers of arguments, growing tensions, and feelings of resentment that neither of them seemed to fully address. While Quinton focused on his career and his children, Niasia's feelings seemed to be building quietly, especially as time went on and their challenges became harder to ignore. Niasia was the mother of his children, the woman he had chosen to be by his side, but their bond was beginning to show cracks. What once seemed like a perfect relationship now had moments of tension, jealousy, and unanswered questions. Niasia, like everyone else, had her own desires, but it became clear that her actions were leading them down a darker path. What Quinton didn't know was that, while he focused on his music and his children, the person closest to him was planning something far more dangerous. Something that would change everything. Behind the facade of their relationship, things were unraveling. The night Quinton Gray was killed, a frantic 911 call was placed by Niasia Perkins. She was barely able to speak clearly as she told the operator that someone had shot her boyfriend. Her voice was filled with panic, but the more the call progressed, the more her story seemed to crumble. In the call, Niasia claimed that she had been in bed with her 2 young children when she heard gunshots. She said she quickly hid her children under the bed, afraid of whoever was inside. She said she didn't know who the shooter was or where they had gone. Her voice was shaky, and she was gasping for air, clearly trying to sound as though she was in distress. However, there were things she said, or didn't say, that raised questions. For one, the timing didn't seem to match up. When Niasia was asked how long it had been since the shooting, she responded that it had happened just 5 minutes ago. However, investigators later found that this couldn't be the case. When they arrived at the scene, there were no signs of forced entry. The doors weren't broken down, and no windows were shattered. This was already suspicious. In a real home invasion, investigators typically expect to find traces of a struggle, someone trying to get in or the intruder fleeing the scene. But according to Niasia, no one entered through the doors, and there was no sign of a break-in. Another odd detail in the 911 call was that Niasia didn't seem to know much about the situation. She couldn't provide any information about the shooter, and even though she was so concerned about her children, she didn't mention if she had tried to check on Quinton. Why didn't she describe the situation in more detail? Was she too frantic, or was she simply not being truthful? As the call continued, Niasia's story began to feel less like a genuine account of a woman in distress and more like a cover-up. The panic in her voice didn't fully align with the lack of urgency in her responses. She hesitated on some questions, leaving out details or providing information that didn't quite fit. The more she talked, the more it seemed as if she was trying to piece together a story rather than recounting a real event. When investigators arrived at the scene, they quickly realized that Niasia's version of events didn't match the evidence. The home, located on Sweet Amy Lane, seemed too calm for what Niasia had described. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, and no glass scattered on the floor. Normally, in cases like this, investigators would expect to find something that showed the suspect had forced their way inside, whether it was a broken window, a kicked-in door, or signs of a struggle. But nothing was out of place in the house. Everything was orderly, except for one thing: Quinton Gray's lifeless body lying in the living room. Quinton had been shot multiple times, but the way his body was positioned seemed strange. He wasn't in a typical position for someone who had been shot during a break-in. Instead, his body appeared to have been moved or staged. It was clear that something wasn't right. The fact that there were no signs of a struggle only deepened the suspicion. If this had been a random act of violence, there should have been some evidence of a fight, a struggle, or something that suggested an intruder was in a hurry to flee. But there was nothing. Niasia had said she was hiding her children under the bed when the shots were fired. She claimed she was scared and didn't know where the shooter had gone. However, when investigators checked the scene, there were no signs of anyone trying to leave the house in a hurry. There weren't any footprints outside, no signs of anyone fleeing the scene, and most importantly, no indication that there had been an intruder at all. The door was locked, the windows were intact, and the house showed no signs of being broken into. As they processed the scene, investigators began to question the events Niasia had described. She claimed she had heard gunshots, yet she was able to stay calm enough to hide her children and make the 911 call. It seemed odd that she would have the presence of mind to do so if she had truly just experienced the trauma of a shooting. She also claimed that she hadn't seen the shooter, yet there were no signs of forced entry or any evidence suggesting the person had even been inside the house. The more investigators looked at the scene, the more questions they had. Niasia's actions following the murder were troubling as well. Instead of being completely overwhelmed with grief, she was quick to post on social media, showing signs of anger rather than sorrow. Her posts seemed defensive and controlling, a stark contrast to what one might expect from someone who had just lost their partner in such a violent way. This behavior raised further suspicions about her involvement in the crime. As the evidence mounted, it became clear to investigators that this was not a random home invasion. There was something more behind the death of Quinton Gray, something planned, something orchestrated. Niasia's story was starting to unravel, and the true nature of the crime began to emerge. The scene in the house was too calm, too controlled for it to be a spur-of-the-moment act. Everything about the crime felt rehearsed, as though someone had taken their time to set up a scene and cover their tracks. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to fall into place. As the investigation into Quinton Gray's murder began, there were immediate red flags. The crime scene simply didn't add up. Niasia's claim that an intruder had broken into the house and shot Quinton seemed less likely with each detail the investigators uncovered. When they examined the house, they found no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no damaged doors, and nothing to suggest a struggle had taken place. If this had been a robbery gone wrong or a random home invasion, there should have been some indication of forceful entry. But there was nothing. The house was calm, almost too calm. No valuables were missing. No sign that anything had been disturbed. This was the first major clue that the crime might have been staged. A real intruder would likely have taken something, or at least left some sign of hasty departure. But the lack of evidence of any break-in or escape route suggested something else. Niasia's behavior only added to the growing doubts. In the hours following the murder, when most people would expect a grieving partner to be overwhelmed with emotion, Niasia seemed eerily calm. She answered investigators' questions without hesitation, but there was something off about the way she did it. Her lack of visible distress was unusual. Normally, someone who had just experienced a traumatic event like a shooting would struggle to remain composed. But Niasia wasn't acting like someone in mourning. She didn't seem shocked or devastated. Instead, she seemed collected and somewhat detached. This strange calmness raised suspicions that Niasia might not be the innocent grieving girlfriend she was trying to portray. As the investigators dug deeper into her story, they began to wonder if Niasia was hiding something. Her lack of panic, the lack of evidence supporting her version of events, and her smooth answers to questions all pointed to the possibility that she had played a bigger role in Quinton's death than she was letting on. The investigation continued, and soon, investigators started looking into Niasia's actions both before and after the murder. They began to trace her movements and her communications in the days leading up to the incident. They analyzed phone records, reviewed social media posts, and checked security footage to uncover any signs of what had really happened that night. One of the first things they uncovered was Niasia's social media activity. Initially, after Quinton's death, she posted about her grief, but over the next few days, her posts began to change. She went from expressing sadness and loss to showing signs of anger and control. The tone of her messages became less about mourning and more about shutting people out, particularly those who wanted to be involved in the funeral arrangements. She made several posts that seemed defensive, as if she was trying to control the narrative of how people viewed her relationship with Quinton. This shift in her online behavior was concerning. It was as though her emotions weren't aligning with what one would expect from someone who had just lost their partner in such a violent way. Her earlier grief was quickly replaced by a need to isolate herself and control the situation, which seemed more like guilt than genuine sorrow. The posts raised alarms, and investigators began to wonder if they were dealing with someone who was trying to cover her tracks, rather than someone simply grieving the loss of her partner. Further investigation into Niasia's phone records revealed more concerning details. She had been in constant contact with Calvin Collie, her co-worker, in the days leading up to the murder. Their communication seemed unusually frequent, with messages exchanged late at night, just days before the shooting. When investigators looked into Calvin's background, they discovered that he had a history of involvement with Niasia that went beyond just work-related matters. He seemed to be more involved in her personal life than what was originally assumed. Niasia's and Calvin's relationship was starting to appear far more complicated than anyone had realized. It seemed that Niasia had confided in Calvin and, possibly, even planned the murder with him. Calvin's role in the crime was becoming clearer, as investigators pieced together his movements and found that he had been in contact with Niasia around the time of Quinton's death. They were connected in a way that made it hard to ignore the possibility that they had both been involved in setting up the crime. The final breakthrough came when authorities discovered that Calvin had been at Niasia's home just before the murder. Security footage from nearby cameras showed his car near the house, and cell phone records confirmed that he had been in the area during the time Quinton was killed. This was the missing piece that tied Calvin to the crime. It was no longer just speculation, there was concrete evidence linking him to the murder. As investigators pieced together all the evidence, it became clear that Niasia and Calvin had orchestrated Quinton's murder together. They had planned it carefully, setting up the scene to look like a home invasion. The lack of forced entry, Niasia's odd behavior, and the growing connection between her and Calvin all pointed to one thing: the crime was a setup, and both of them had played a role in it. By the time the investigation had fully unfolded, authorities had gathered enough evidence to charge both Niasia Perkins and Calvin Collie with first-degree murder and felony conspiracy. The shocking truth had finally been revealed, and it was clear that Niasia, the woman who had appeared so devastated by Quinton's death, was anything but innocent. After weeks of investigation, the authorities finally closed in on Niasia Perkins and Calvin Collie. The evidence gathered from phone records, social media posts, and security footage had built a strong case against them. Investigators had uncovered the connection between the two, which led them to make the arrests. Niasia and Calvin were arrested at their places of work in Kinston, North Carolina. Niasia was taken into custody without incident, but it was clear from the moment she was arrested that the game had changed. She was no longer the grieving girlfriend but a suspect in a carefully orchestrated murder. Calvin was arrested shortly after Niasia, and both were charged with first-degree murder and felony conspiracy. These charges were serious and carried severe penalties, reflecting the gravity of the crime they had committed. The charge of first-degree murder meant that investigators believed the killing was premeditated. Quinton's death wasn't an accident or a crime of passion, it had been planned. The felony conspiracy charge pointed to the fact that Niasia and Calvin had worked together to carry out the crime. They had planned the fake break-in and staged the scene to mislead investigators, making it look like a random act of violence. The significance of these charges could not be understated. First-degree murder carried the possibility of life in prison or even the death penalty, depending on the state's laws. Conspiracy to commit murder added an extra layer of criminal intent, showing that Niasia and Calvin had collaborated to take Quinton's life. The case was a heartbreaking example of betrayal, and the authorities knew that this was a crime that had shattered not only Quinton's family but the entire community. What led to their arrests was a combination of careful investigation and the mounting inconsistencies in Niasia's story. She had tried to paint herself as an innocent bystander, a woman who had lost the father of her children in a violent act. But the evidence didn't support her narrative. The phone records, social media posts, and security footage all pointed back to Niasia and Calvin. Their involvement was undeniable, and it was only a matter of time before they were apprehended. When news of the arrests broke, the community was left in shock. The details of the case had already been disturbing, but the fact that Niasia and Calvin had been involved in such a cold and calculated crime stunned many. Some people were shocked that a mother, someone who appeared to have everything, her family, her children, could be capable of such betrayal. Others, however, weren't as surprised. There had been whispers, suspicions, and murmurs in the days leading up to the arrests. People started to question Niasia's behavior and wondered if there was more to the story than what she had let on. For Quinton's family, the pain of losing him was unbearable, but the realization that someone so close to him had played a role in his death made the hurt even worse. His family expressed disbelief and anger at Niasia's actions. How could the woman who was supposed to love and protect him betray him in such a brutal way? The grief of losing Quinton was compounded by the shock that his death had been planned by someone he trusted. They were left with more questions than answers, and the pain was overwhelming. Social media played a major role in the aftermath of the arrests. Niasia, who had once used her posts to share her sorrow and grief, quickly became the subject of intense scrutiny. Her social media accounts, once filled with loving posts about her family and Quinton, became the platform for a different side of her. As soon as the arrest news broke, her posts took a turn. Instead of mourning, she began to display anger and frustration. Her tone shifted dramatically, as if she were trying to control the narrative. The same social media that had once portrayed her as a grieving partner now became a place where she pushed back against the accusations, even as the evidence mounted against her. The public's reaction to these changes was swift. Many were confused and disturbed by Niasia's shift from grief to anger and control. Was this the behavior of someone still grieving, or was it the reaction of someone who feared the consequences of their actions? People who had once sympathized with her started to question her motives. It was clear that Niasia was no longer the woman she had claimed to be in the wake of Quinton's death. The dynamic between Niasia and Calvin appears to be more than just a working relationship. Their frequent communication, especially around the time of Quinton's murder, suggests a deeper connection. Calvin may have felt that Niasia was the key to a life he wanted, and he could have seen Quinton as an obstacle standing in the way of that life. Calvin's criminal history, though not fully explored, could also have played a role in his willingness to participate in the crime. He might have seen the murder as a way to protect his relationship with Niasia or as a chance to gain something he felt he deserved. His actions seemed to be driven by a mixture of emotions, love, desire for control, and perhaps financial motivation. As an accomplice, Calvin played a crucial role in helping Niasia execute the plan. He helped her set the stage for the crime, ensuring that the fake break-in would be convincing. His involvement made it clear that the murder wasn't just the result of one person's actions but rather the collaboration of two people with shared motives. Calvin's role in the murder shows how deeply entwined he was in Niasia's life and how far he was willing to go to achieve his goals. Niasia Perkins and Calvin Collie were both charged with first-degree murder and felony conspiracy in connection with the death of Quinton Gray. These charges reflected the cold, calculated nature of the crime they committed together. Niasia, once seen as a grieving partner, was now facing the reality of her betrayal. Calvin Collie, the co-worker who became her accomplice, was equally implicated in the plot. As of now, both individuals are awaiting trial. The case has been closely followed by the public, as the details of their involvement in Quinton's murder continue to shock and sadden those who knew him. The investigation has concluded, and authorities have gathered enough evidence to ensure that Niasia and Calvin will face the legal consequences of their actions. The trial is expected to bring more clarity to the specifics of the case, and sentencing will ultimately determine their fate. This case serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of betrayal and the far-reaching effects it can have. Niasia's actions were not only an attack on Quinton, but also on the trust that had been built over years of relationship and family. Premeditated murder isn't just a crime against one person, it's an act that destroys the lives of many, leaving lasting scars on loved ones and the community. Manipulation and control often play a hidden role in crimes like this. Niasia's ability to manipulate her social image after Quinton's death and the way she attempted to control the narrative online shows how powerful influence and selfish desires can be in shaping actions. The way she used her public persona to mask the truth only added another layer to her betrayal. One of the most important lessons from this case is the need to question the story when the facts don't align. Niasia's story fell apart when the evidence didn't support her claims. The lack of physical evidence, her odd behavior, and the inconsistencies in her statements all pointed to the truth. In cases of crime, we must be careful not to simply accept what we're told at face value, especially when it doesn't make sense. This case reminds us how deep betrayal can run and how easily those closest to us can turn on us when their own selfish desires take over. It's a painful truth that we must all be aware of. Sometimes, the greatest threat comes from within. If you found this story as gripping as we did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about Niasia's actions? Could she have been the one behind it all from the start?